When you think of logic, you probably picture something ancient, maybe a little rigid, definitely unchanging. Black and white. True or false? But what if I told you that about a century ago, this ancient discipline had to completely reinvent itself just to survive? We're going to dive into the incredible story of how logic fought for its life and in the process blossomed from black and white into a whole spectrum of color. And I'm not exaggerating. This wasn't just some dusty academic debate. The source material calls this transformation a genuine struggle for survival and scientific progress. Seriously, the very soul of logic was on the line as it stared down the dawn of a new scientific age. So, how in the world did this happen? How did logic go from this monolithic pillar, the idea of one single universal way of thinking, into this diverse, adaptable, and, dare I say it, colorful toolkit of different logical systems? Well, that's the exact journey we're on in this explainer. Okay, so our story kicks off at a moment of genuine crisis. Logic, which had been a cornerstone of philosophy for millennia, suddenly found itself staring into the abyss of total irrelevance. You see, for centuries, logic was just seen as the philosophy of thinking. But with science and mathematics making these giant leaps forward, that just wasn't cutting it anymore. Logic had a really stark choice: evolve into a rigorous modern science, or become a fossil of intellectual history. So what exactly was the problem? Why was this system, which had worked for thousands of years, suddenly failing? Well, the simple answer is that its toolkit was fundamentally outdated for the modern world. And this slide really puts it into perspective. For over 2,000 years, think about that, Aristotelian logic was supreme. It was the way to think. And then, almost overnight, it hit a wall. The pressures of the modern world created a crisis point it just could not handle. This quote just nails it. The old logic simply did not correspond to the needs of the new era. It couldn't provide that rock-solid foundation, what's beautifully called the vestibule of science, that modern discovery absolutely demanded. It was time for complete overhaul. And that overhaul came from a kind of surprising place. To save itself, logic looked over at its neighbor, mathematics. It went through this intense process of mathematization. And this gave birth to what we now call mathematical logic or symbolic logic. The core idea was to stop treating logic like a set of philosophical guidelines and start analyzing arguments with the exact same rigor and precision as a mathematical proof. So how'd they do it? Well, it was basically a three-step process. First, you build a brand new, super precise symbolic language, no ambiguity allowed. Second, you define these strict, unbendable rules for how to get from one step to the next. And finally, you can analyze the entire argument with mathematical clarity. It was a complete revolution. And this wasn't just some technical fix. Philosophically, this was huge. This new formal logic created a powerful bridge. It was a much better way to represent logos, that really deep, classical idea of the unity between our structured thought and the language we use to express it. But here is the twist in the story. In solving one problem, this powerful new logic accidentally uncovered a much deeper, way more confusing one. It actually led to a crisis of certainty. You see, this shiny new mathematical logic was immediately thrown at the biggest challenge of the day, trying to justify the very foundations of mathematics. The big question was, could logic provide an absolutely unshakable bedrock for all of math? And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about crunching numbers. The source describes a blood tie between this new logic and the philosophical problems of math. It turned out that even with these powerful new tools, the quest for one single perfect foundation was still deeply subjective and, as the source says, philosophically colored. One of the most famous attempts to solve this whole mess was logicism. It was championed by the brilliant and, let's be honest, audacious Bertrand Russell. His goal was to prove that all of mathematics was nothing more than a branch of pure deductive logic. No big deal, right? But that attempt, and a bunch of others like it, led to a completely unexpected result. Instead of finding one true logic to rule them all, the struggle for certainty completely shattered the whole idea of a single universal logic. So the outcome wasn't unity, it was an explosion of diversity. A whole bunch of different logics emerged from the ashes of the old system. For the first time, what we call logical relativism became an established fact. There simply wasn't just one right way to be logical anymore. And suddenly, the world of logic looked kind of like this. The classical true or false system we're all familiar with was now just one color in this vibrant rainbow, joined by new systems like intuitionistic and paraconsistent logics, and a whole bunch of others. So how different are they really? Well, this table gives a great snapshot. In classical logic, if you find a contradiction, the whole system blows up. Game over. In intuitionistic logic, something isn't true until you've actually built a proof for it. And then there's paraconsistent logic, where a system can actually contain a contradiction and just keep on functioning. 3 totally different ways of looking at truth.
And this is the ultimate takeaway here. This whole diversification created an incredibly powerful toolkit. Different logics are now designed for different jobs. You might use one for pure math, another one for dealing with vague real-world data, and yet another for analyzing systems that have conflicting information baked right in.
So, in the end, logic survived its crisis, but not by finding one perfect answer. It survived by discovering that there are many right answers. It transformed from a rigid rulebook into this adaptable set of tools. And that leaves us with a fascinating new question. If there isn't one true logic, how do we learn to choose the right one for the right problem?